Hello, today is November 19th, 2015. I'm meeting today with Mr. Francis Lovett at his home in Windsor, Colorado. My name is Brad Hoops. I'm the interviewer for the Northern Colorado Veterans History Project. Welcome, Francis, and thanks for sitting down today to tell your story.
And welcome to you.
Thank you. Let's start out, if we could. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your date of birth, where you're born, a little bit about your family.
Fair enough. I was born July 9th, 1922, in Northampton, Massachusetts. And I come from a long line of Irish. I'm a first-generation Irishman myself. And was brought up in a small town outside Northampton, Hatfield. That was the time when tobacco and onions were the big crops. And my father was different in that he was manager of a machine tool shop when everybody else raised tobacco or onions. I went through the local schools until high school and then went to Northampton High School. After that I went to Williston Academy in East Hampton, Mass. And from there I went to Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut.
Well, let me back up
Right.
a little bit. Any brothers and sisters?
Oh yes. I had 3 sisters. My eldest sister is still alive, and she'll be 100 this coming March. Yeah.
Wow.
So we come from a line of pretty good genes.
And where'd you fit in that order of kids?
I had 2 sisters, then me, and then my youngest sister was 5 years younger than me. My oldest sister and I are the only ones left.
I'll be darned. Wow.
Yeah.
One question I always like to ask your generation, and I don't know if you have much memory of it, but or if your folks ever talked about it, but was your family affected by the Great Depression?
If they were, I didn't notice it. We never wanted, we had big gardens. And I'm sure that during that same time was when things were building up in the machine tool business so that the Depression didn't hit us that hard. I was able to go to prep school, and I was able to go to college at the tail end of it without having to have financial aid. And I do recall that in 1938, my dad went to England and Ireland, and he came back and said with considerable pride, I sold $1 million worth of machinery.
Wow.
So I know there was something in the machine tool business that kind of negated the effects other people had in the Depression.
Gotcha. So I'm sorry, you can continue your story. So you're off to college, and
Yeah, and there, well, I was always interested in music. I was a boy soprano, and after my voice changed, over the years I was a decent baritone, but I became involved in stock theater, Gilbert and Sullivan mostly, and did that in boarding school, and then with a year and a half in college. Of course, Pearl Harbor made a big difference. I had entered Wesleyan in the fall of '41.
Oh, wow.
And I was able to finish my freshman year. There I was a member of the undefeated wrestling team.
Wow.
I was 165 of them. Now I'm 171.
Wow.
But we were supposed to, of course, resist the draft in that stay in school, they kept saying, stay in school until you're called. Well, I saw kind of a training film that was making the round of New England colleges in the fall of '42. And it was to enlist ski troopers. So I got my 3 letters of recommendation in the fall of 1942 I enlisted in September of 1942,
Wow.
and then just waited for the call, which took a while. I didn't get to Camp Hale until March of 43.
What was the attraction?
Well, I was, what they were campaigning for was skiers, climbers, people outdoors skills, and so on. I was a decent skier. Anybody in Massachusetts was,
Yeah.
but not world class the way the 10th attracted some of them. But I had experience climbing. My aunt was an Irish hill walker, and in this country she continued that love she had. And of course, in the Connecticut Valley, the mountains are hills.
Yeah.
They're old, but they're still, when you're 9 or 10, they're pretty big.
Yeah.
And she started me in that business of climbing, not technical, but liking to carry a pack and go uphill and then see the view and marvel. So then when I was at Wesleyan, I had a professor of geology in my freshman year, Max Demarest, who was world famous on the studying the flow of glaciers and such.
Oh, wow.
And I did some climbing with him in some of the old quarries in Connecticut, and learned from him some of the technical climbing. And when I submitted my letters, I had one from my wrestling coach, one from the ski coach at my prep school, and one from Max Demarest, and was found acceptable, not knowing what was ahead.
Yeah. Wow.
And I was then, I waited in college until January of 43, and then got the word. I was to report. I had to go to Devon's, and I wasn't there very long. Everybody seemed to know where I was going, and I wasn't supposed to know, which intrigued me. And I remember a very earnest corporal who took us to the train. There were about 9 of us came together to go out to Camp Hale, and he told us, "Men, you can't tell anybody where you're going. You're not supposed to know where you're going. We don't know where you're going." So they
Wow. Oh, wow.
we'd all had the letters saying, "You're in." So they put us on a train, and it took quite a while. We went by way of Chicago and St. Louis. I don't remember all the stops, but my first entry into Colorado was via the way south. What is that wonderful gorge?
Royal Gorge?
The Royal Gorge.
Oh,
was one of
really?
the first things I saw.
Oh,
coming
really?
into
Oh,
Colorado.
wow.
And somehow from there we ended up at the Pando siding and were escorted off the train and reported to, we didn't have the faintest idea where, because...
But this was your first time west, correct?
It was my first time west of Chicago, yes.
Wow.
But I'd always had an affection for hills and mountains and stuff. And had done some minor climbing in the Adirondacks. There are 2 or 3 good places there. But and then I ended at Camp Hale, the 9 of us. At that time, they hadn't yet formed the 86th Regiment. They had the 87th. They were putting us into, well, when I got there, it was not a company, it was just called D Prime. It later became I Company of the 86th. And then we began our training. We did not have time to say, "Sit, fellas, and learn the altitude and learn how to breathe and stuff." Oh, no.
Wow.
We started right in and learned all sorts of things the hard way. For instance, those of us who had skied New England thought, "This is lovely, Colorado. That powder snow
Yeah, oh, yeah.
is gorgeous," but it didn't fight back the way New England snow did. And first thing you know, you're out of control and you're all over the slope. So we had to learn that. I never had any problem with the altitude. Numbers of men that I knew did, and they couldn't climb above a certain height. And if they were disposed to things like asthma, they were done for. Because that railroad that ran right up the incline to the west of the camp, up above the edge of Pando Valley. It took 3 engines pulling the freight cars, and they all burned coal. And every furnace in Camp Hale burned coal. So we had inversions. And that led to occasional bouts for some. I didn't have any problem with it, fortunately, but they called it the Pando hack. It did rule some out. They simply couldn't tolerate that
Wow.
in that thin air, and they were gone. Others lived with it, and I was lucky. I was neither affected by altitude nor the coal smoke. So training began in earnest about 2 days after we got there, just long enough to get our equipment. And interesting things happened. Physical education major, I remember his telling me he'd come from Springfield College, which was in the Connecticut Valley,
Mm-hmm.
and he was a well-being nut. And he led us up Eagle Creek in the water, running up the creek to get us in shape. And some of those who were in charge hadn't had the experience that numbers of the enlisted men had had. And it made for some serious errors
Oh, wow.
that were painful. But finally, I'd say within 2 weeks, they sorted us out to those who were able to ski, those who were good enough to instruct, and they sent a lot of them to Cooper Hill, which they had built for the 10th down there near Tennessee Pass. And they spent days and days and days instructing, which was a nice job. I didn't get one of them. I'd been in about a month, a little more than a month, when they had routine physical exams. And one of the ophthalmologists discovered that I didn't have sight in my left eye. Well, I knew that. And I nonetheless been able to enlist with the aid of a friendly physician. And he said, well, you're limited service. And I said, well, no, it's congenital, and I learned to adapt with it. But anyway, he said, you can't be in the 10th. So I was put into the service company. And at that point, I met, not large, but an unsympathetic first sergeant in the service company who said to me when I reported, you train dogs? I said, no. You drive trucks? I said, no. He said, what the hell you do? I said, well, I don't have a particular job. I've just come from college. A college kid, get down the kitchen. So I went to the kitchen, and I was in the kitchen as a permanent KP for about 35 days. And I ran into one of my friends who said, they can't do that. And I said, well, they're doing it. And he said, why don't you see the chaplain? Well, it hadn't occurred to me. So I went over and saw Captain Brendamel, who was the first chaplain I could find, and told him my story. And he picked up the phone and he said, Major Gregg, do you need another medic? And the answer was yes. And right there, I became a medic, and I could stay in the 10th because then I was officially a non-combatant.
Wow.
Which I always thought was lovely. Of course, we got all the training, went overseas, went through combat and so on, but I was non-combatant. And so then I began medical training, and that was really excellent. We had a series of lectures, very practical, hands-on lectures at the camp, and then there was schooling at Fitzsimmons, in the old Fitzsimmons in Denver, in various areas. I, for instance, was sent down to learn burn and orthopedic.
Hmm.
So my first experience of Fitzsimmons was when they were doing surgery on a guy and they were removing some of his ribs. And fortunately, I never had to do that.
Wow.
But I did get some very good training on treating burns. And then the regular on-duty training of dealing with all sorts of illnesses and medical possibilities and how you do it in combat. Then I was fortunate enough, they told me, I had a furlough. When I came back, I found I had won a company lottery. And I was going to go to a brand new established mule packing school. I didn't know anything about mules, but I learned. And I went to school and I learned to pack mules and deal with mules and stay out of the way of, they can kick in 4 directions and bite. They didn't often, but there were a few that were bound to make their ways known. But then that was for, I was then qualified to pack the medical equipment, the litters and stuff, when we went into the field, mule and all. That came into practical use later in Italy, but at that time I didn't think it was much of a prize. And there were other efforts that were made at Camp Hale that were tried. They were great for experimenting because they had no experience in the U.S. Army with mountain troops.
Yeah.
They were learning as they went. And some of the brass was set in their ways, whether it had been cavalry or infantry. This is the way you do it, no matter the altitude, the depth of snow. And so it made for learning experiences for them as well as us. But it was arduous physical training. I swear when I got out of service, I didn't get out of shape for about 20 years.
Really? Wow. Wow.
Well, I went in, my non-wrestling weight was about 172, and at the end of the first 6 months I weighed 155, and I was not puny. They simply moved it around, and then I gradually put that back on. Our rucksacks were one of the things that contributed to physical development. We carried about 90 pounds, and we carried it on skis, and we carried it uphill or downhill or whatever, and it included all the regular equipment you had, your extra clothing, underwear, a double down sleeping bag, Primus stove. We worked in twos, so that if I carried the stove, for instance, my partner carried the fuel. If I carried the mountain tent, he carried the pegs and ropes. If I carried the climbing rope, he carried the ice axe. That split it. It was a good idea because it made good twosomes where you learned to trust.
Mm-hmm.
And it also made it possible for everybody to carry the damn weight.
Yeah, right.
But it did average about 90 pounds. And they even wrote a song about it that was to the old bell-bottom trousers tune. 90 pounds of rucksack, a pound of grub or two, and he'll shuss the mountains like his daddy used to do. Only on those military skis you don't shuss. They were wide and stiff and built for cross-country and very controlled down skiing, downhill. And that was frustrating for those of us who knew some other kinds of skiing, but you did it. And for instance, in the medics, one of the things I learned was how to evacuate a wounded warrior on a toboggan down a steep grade, controlling it with my skis out front. That kind of training.
Wow.
That you don't, and the Army didn't have any experienced people that way. We learned as we went. And fortunately, numbers of the officers, after about 3 or 4 months, had been with the 87th, which had formed out at Fort Lewis, worked on Mount Rainier, had been to Kiska in 43 and back. They had experience and had come back from OCS and understood and knew how to do, so that we got things done the way they should. And it was not unusual on a field maneuver to have an enlisted man being the expert and everybody else going along with him. I know when the 87th made an unusual, it's not the only, but they made an unusual winter climb on Mount Rainier. And the expedition was led and directed by Peter Gabriel, who's a corporal.
Really? Wow.
But he had come from Switzerland and had been running a ski school in New Hampshire, but his profession was guide and mountaineer. And he later became one of my teachers in rock climbing. And I valued his experience. So life at Camp Hale went on, and we had numbers of things that were tried and abandoned. Dogs. We had dogs they wanted to use for messengers, dogs for stringing wire, and sled dogs. And found out that the messenger or wire stringers were good only when there wasn't snow. And we had a lot of snow there. It averaged about 160 some inches a year up at Pandal Gulf. And the dogs couldn't go. And the sled dogs couldn't pull sleds in that depth of snow. And the problem with them was too that they run by instinct, and they run with their mouths open. And so you began to get dogs with frostbitten lungs. And so they gave up the dogs, didn't give up the mules. And they did, I recall, although I was not a witness to it, but I do recall that maybe on Homestake Lake or maybe on Turquoise Lake, but somewhere in the Holy Cross of the Maroon Bells area, they experimented with paraski troopers.
Oh, wow.
And it didn't work.
Yeah.
And I know at one point they did make an effort to use gliders to bring in supplies, and that they found updrafts, downdrafts, mountains. That wasn't going to work. So many things were tried and abandoned wisely. But we did have some remarkably good equipment that was on the cusp of what now is common. Our sleeping bags, for instance, were 100% down. We had an inner mummy case and an outer kind of a flat, like a zipper robe around. In that, those two bags, you could sleep out 30 below, 40 below, no problem.
Really?
And you
Wow.
didn't sleep in all your clothes. We had what I think was probably the very early experiments with freeze-dried foods, where you just added water, and we had some decent meals in the field that we could prepare ourselves from these packages. There was one experiment with a thing they called pemmican that I remember because I was part of that experiment. It looked like sort of like summer sausage, approximately the diameter of a silver dollar. And the instructions were you took one slice, which was about, I'd say, a 1/4 inch thick, 3 times a day. That was your meal. We didn't lose energy, we didn't lose strength, but we did lose weight. And they found out that wasn't going to work, not because it wasn't easy to carry, which it was, and wasn't nourishing, but it was so expensive.
Huh.
And the Army was conscious of expense too. So we had numbers of those. There was a warming piece of equipment you could carry. It looked like a oversized pot holder, probably 8 inches square. And I think it had iron filings in it. All you did was add a little water, manipulate it, and it would produce heat, which you could then put against your back inside your sleeping bag. That was a good thing. We used that for a while, and then it was withdrawn, disappeared. We didn't have those anymore. But clothing, if I started out on a day and I had my long underwear, and on my feet I had a pair of lightweight socks, cotton. Some of the fellows wore silk if they got them from home, but silk was hard to come by. And then over that, wool socks. And over that, either our ski boot or our mountain boot or our shoe pack. And then wool trousers. Sometimes they were ski pants. And they withdrew those after a while, probably decided they were too expensive or perhaps not practical. But wool trousers. Let's see, then over my underwear top I would have a kind of an open mesh sweater, wool. Over that my wool shirt. And what we were doing then, although nobody called it that, layering, which became everybody did. And it worked. Outer garments might have been a mountain jacket, which was a specially cut. It had a balloon back so that you could put it on over your rucksack, like a jacket, and then still fasten it. And that was, I'm not sure what the material was, probably ripstop nylon or something early, windproof, but not warmproof. Then we had a parka, which fell to just below the knees in length, but it had a drawstring so you could tuck it up around the waist if you wanted to. That was reversible. One side was OD, the other side was camouflage white. And when we used the whites, then we pulled on a little pair of whites over all our clothes, looked like pajamas, and drawstring, and supposedly disappeared. The parkas, the first ones we had, were trimmed at the hood with wolverine fur, because wolverine fur in extreme cold does not collect moisture and freeze up and you get big beads of ice around your face. But either wolverines were hard to find or it was too expensive, and eventually it became whatever fur was on there, and it did collect moisture and freeze. And so you didn't. Well, you got some great pictures to send home, but and then we had training that I remember with a great deal of pleasure. There was a Norwegian explorer, I think he'd been Arctic explorer, who came to Camp Hale, and he spent some time teaching us how to make snow caves and igloos, and that was great fun. And I found out wonderful things about the snow cave, we didn't do much with igloos because trying to cut the bricks, you couldn't always get the right kind of snow, but to build into big drifts. But if you took a plumber's candle, once you had the thing dug out to the size you wanted, plumber's candle, and lighted it and just traced around the walls, and it would create a little moisture that immediately froze. And then all of a sudden, the plumber's candle would light that place like a 100-watt bulb.
Wow.
And even generate a little heat. So we had good times with that kind of training. And I was trying to think of the other, well, of course, rock climbing. They had a school in West Virginia. The name of the school I don't remember, but it was something rock, where they sent some people to learn to climb. And we had our own rock climbing area. I think it was on the east side of Camp Hale. Pretty good rock, and with different degrees of sedimentary formations in it, so that you got practice on stuff as hard as granite and stuff that is likely to be faulty as sandstone. But mostly we worked on the hard stuff, and there I learned the use of pitons, carabiners, rope climbing. And I had two teachers that I really have great affection for. Peter Gabriel was one. He was the Swiss. And the other was Paul Petzold, who had been kind of a phenomenon in his own right. He grew up in Wyoming. He had made an expedition on K2. He was the one who, every day while he could, and he lived to be 92 or 3, climbed the Grand Teton every New Year's Day. He was a bear of a man.
Wow.
He was something. And he taught things that the Army had no manuals for, out of his experience on safety, on removals, on, for instance, he found that I had a value for rock climbing that was a little unique in my platoon. I have a very keen sense of pitch and used to be able to pick pitches out of the air and sing them. Well, I would listen to pitons, and when you drive it in with a hammer, it just tic-tac-ticks, but when it gets to a certain point, the pitch begins to ascend. And when it gets up to a certain pitch, you know it's firm, and then of course you test it. But I could hear the pitons at the point, and Paul thought that was very valuable.
Wow.
So, however, that has very little social value. Carry over. It's a little like my wrestling. After other people entertained a bridge, you can't entertain a wrestling. But we had all those different kinds of training, and at the same time, I never got to Leadville more than twice because it was off limits most of the time. And I did go frequently to Glenwood Springs when I'd have a weekend pass. And there were people there who were very kind. And one family in particular, I remember the Woods, who took in 3 or 4 of us when we came there, and we always ate well and got to dance with the daughters and that kind of thing. They were fine people. And I like Glenwood Springs.
Yeah.
Although we were never allowed to go to the that beautiful hot springs.
Oh, really? How come?
At that time, it was the Navy was running it, and it was for Marine convalescents.
That's right.
So we stayed out of it, and there wasn't anything at that time other than just going. I sang in the church choir when I could go down there, because it was something you do, and you meet Sunday dinner sometimes doing that. So, and let's see, what do we do?
Talk a little bit about life in Camp Hale, the living conditions, the foods,
the barracks were 2-floor. I think they held maybe 50 personnel each, and were pretty well insulated. The daily routine, it simply depended. If you were infantry, the infantrymen went out to drill. They went to the shooting range, or they went to whatever that had to do with infiltration, obstacle courses, that sort of thing. We had medical training. We had field maneuvers where we simulated programs of evacuation, or what they call them, what if situations, what if this or that, and kind of refined our medical skills. The food I always thought was excellent. They did recognize that at that altitude and the energy they were requiring of us daily in just physical activity warranted good food and plenty of it. And I can tell you from my experience as a KP that it was well prepared, well consumed. I don't know much about what went on in certainly not in the Officers Club nor the NCOs clubs. The PXs, we could go and have 3.2 beer, which can be effective at 9,200 feet.
Right, yeah.
And they had movies, and occasional shows came. I know that at the field house, for a very brief time, we had a well-known boxer whose claim to fame was that he had gone 15 rounds with Lewis,
Huh.
and Lewis hadn't caught him. His name was Bob Pastor. And I expect he's probably still somewhere in the internet if you look him up. But he found that, I don't know how he got there to start with, but he found that the routine at Camp Hale did not appeal. And somehow he managed to get himself transferred at Flatland somewhere in special service. But we used to play a trick on him. When you fall out in the morning for reveille, and they have present arms and so on, and order arms, were at that time, they were training with Springfields with a bolt action, and somebody would tip the flag up on his rifle. When it came to throw it right into the snow or the dirt, and he never caught on. He was apparently a very skillful defensive boxer, but not a lot else. But I know he gave boxing lessons. He was charging 50 cents a lesson at the field house, and I don't know who took him up on it and that, but Frank Bowles, who was another fellow from Wesleyan with me, had also been a wrestler, and we were giving lessons for 35 cents. And one night I was waiting for Frank to show up, and Pastor came out and he saw me. I was sitting there, and I had on my shoes that were made for that time for wrestling on canvas. It was before they had the nylon covers.
Mm.
And he looked at me, he said, "You fight in Holyoke?" And I said, "No." He said, "You fight in Providence?" "No." And he asked me some other place. And he said, "Well, where'd you fight?" I said, "I didn't. I'm a wrestler." He looked at me and he said, "A wrestler?" And he turned around and stalked off. I suppose he had visions of Gorgeous George or something. Yeah. So life was not all grim at Camp Hale, but it was very serious training, and it went on. And it went on. And there was just before I got there in 43, they had tried a maneuver to see how the troops would perform in extreme weather conditions. And they went out to Homestake Peak and Homestake Lake area and got into all sorts of difficulties because the snow was deep. Numbers of the men that they took had been in camp only a few days, weren't in physical condition to do it. The weather was brutal. Excuse me. And the officers were regular Army, and they simply didn't understand. And so they tried things. Well, one of the wonderful things that happened was that they had somebody from the War Department and Minnie Dole, who had been the reason behind and the moving force behind our ever having a 10th Mountain Division. I don't know if you've heard of Minnie or not. Well, he was at that too, to see. And at one point, where the officers were sleeping in tents and the men were out in the weather, one of the officers decided to demonstrate how you bring down an avalanche so you don't have, we used to do that, bring them down so we didn't get caught. But he brought this one down, and it came right smack down on Homestead Lake. And when it hit, it almost drained the lake with this great fountain
Wow.
that made a very impressive display with about a 6-foot wall of snow that just cleaned that lake out. And of course, the report went back to Washington. And I think they began to pay attention to the fact that you couldn't just take an old cavalryman or some man and say, okay, you're now in charge of the mountain troops. But the next year, in 44, we went on a 6-week field maneuver. It was called D Series. And it was war games, and it was in the high country. We were up at 12, 13,000 feet, working all sorts of problems in communication, in transportation, in evacuation, in attack, in guerrilla tactics. It went 6 weeks. I remember that. I think it was March, April of 44. But during that maneuver, we had one of the worst blizzards they'd had in years, and it went on for a couple of days. Well, the maneuvers didn't end, because supposing that happened. And there were unavoidable cases of frostbite, and there were injuries from falls, skiing, and cross-country conditions. Catch a ski in a deadfall, it knocks you flat. And one of the difficulties in the 10th was at that point you couldn't get out of your ski. They didn't have release bindings. And if the ski stayed and you didn't, it ended up with a lot of spiral fractures. And so we had some that had to be evacuated because of injury. But we survived the 6 weeks, and there were numbers of the fellows who had been through that who considered anybody who had been through D series, and didn't think it worse than combat, hadn't really been there. And I could see his point. The only difference was in combat, we didn't have a blizzard. And in D series, nobody was shooting at us, just over us. And there was a little friendly fire casualty occasionally too. But then, I think it was late June 44, we were all recovered from D series and talking about, yes, we survived. We suddenly were packed up and sent to Texas, Camp Swift, which I found deplorable. You come to the situation where you left that altitude and were zipped down by train and supposed to go on 25-mile marches and stuff in July heat.
Oh.
At that point, I think they were under the mistaken idea that salt was the answer, so you had to take salt tablets. Years later, I learned, don't do that, it'll kill you. But we were there about 5 months, I think. But in that time, I ended up in the hospital because I had a chronic dislocation of the right shoulder that I got originally wrestling and hadn't thought much about it. And over time, it got pretty loose. And when I, last time at Hale, when I was coming downhill and I caught a ski pole, I think it was on some kind of a juniper growth or something, caught the ski pole and pulled my arm out. They decided in Texas they'd repair it. So I went into the hospital and they did what they call a Nicola Suspension, which involved drilling through the head of the humerus and taking tendon from the back and splicing it to the biceps tendon so that your arm couldn't come out again, and it's worked. It's
Really?
never come out again.
Wow.
But it left me with some restricted motion. But while I was in there, everybody got ready to go overseas. And I was released, but the 86th had just started to train out, so I was reassigned to the 85th and went overseas with the 2nd Battalion of the 85th Regiment. And we went on the, I think it was the West Point, but I know it had been a passenger ship. And it was fast enough, if I remember the stories, it was fast enough that it outstripped any of the covering protective ships in the Navy. So we spent 9 days from Patrick Henry, Virginia to Naples just tacking around all by ourselves.
And how was that trip for you personally? Did you get your sea legs, or how was the travel?
Yeah, I never had any problem with
No?
it, but
Is that
there were
right?
those who suffered.
Oh, yeah.
The thing that I found most inhumane was that everything was on a 24-hour cycle. And you went to breakfast when your time came. And if breakfast happened to be at 2 in the afternoon, which meant that lunch came at 6 and supper came at 10, that's what you did or you didn't eat. And the one thing I found unsettling, and others found really upsetting, was on this long shelf where you lined up and they were putting stuff in your mess gear. As the ship did this and the mess gear shifted, well, you didn't know exactly what was going to be in your next spoonful or whose it was going to be. So you waited, and when it came back and you ate what was in front of you. And I always thought that was terrible of the Navy to do that. But we survived. And on board ship we had lectures in close quarters and some music. There was a young lieutenant that I never saw again after we left, but he played clarinet with Woody Herman, and so he entertained us. And there was, of course, the perpetual floating crap and poker games. When we got to Naples, that was off limits.
Now, did they tell you where you guys were heading when you took off?
No,
No.
no. When we got out to sea, then the word came from somebody, yes, we will be at Naples. And I remember for the first time seeing Gibraltar, which was something. But I couldn't see anything of Naples because we weren't allowed off into the city. And the next day, we got into the LCIs, landing craft, and were ferried up the coast to Livorno, Leghorn. And getting off there, we then went in either by truck or on foot to a round piece of, not far from Florence, some of the smaller towns, Gavinana, Castigliano, Viticciatico, those areas in the vicinity of what became our battlegrounds. And that was January. Patrols began then, and there was feeling around to see what the strength was opposing us, where it was. There was one patrol I was on that we did on skis, because we had a fair amount of snow at that time. And we got to an edge of a pretty decent valley that had kind of a snow cornice across it. And we were there, and suddenly we were aware of there was a German soldier on skis coming across. So the platoon leader hollered at him to stop, put his hands up. The fellow stopped, And he looked and he listened. And he suddenly did a jump turn. He went right down the corner. Nobody shot at him. And I thought, boy, there's a skier. But I know there was one firefight on those patrols. And there was one in early January when we lost 2 or 3 men. I think it was on a patrol and they hit landmines
Oh boy.
that had been planted.
Oh.
Yeah. Then what it was get ready for. I was billeted in Gavinana, the numbers of medics with me, in a house that belonged to Savannah and Giorgio Ferrari, 2 lovely people, older than we, but I'd say in their 40s. And they tried very hard not to get in our way. And I think it must have been very difficult for them because it was their house, but it was our quarters. And we did our best to ingratiate ourselves with them. And from there, we had daily exercises, a lot of map work. And I don't remember any specific incidents after the patrol I was on until February, early February, when they began to plan the attack on Mount Belvedere, which was the highest in the area. Now it's not the Rockies, but it was about 6,000 feet probably. And the Germans had done an excellent job over a long period of time of mounting observation posts, artillery, and they controlled the main highways. And our job was to get them off there, to open the highways so we could push on. And their job, of course, was to stop it. And we sent out patrols, I think over a total of about 10 days. And they sent the patrols of the expert mountaineers. And they found 5 possible ascent routes on about a 3-mile series of ridges that the Germans controlled, and it was called Riva Ridge. Mm-hmm. And they found it was guarded from 3 sides, but the Germans said the other side couldn't be climbed. So we did. They sent the scouts out, dark, muffled hammers, and fixed the ropes. Because when you get men going up, you don't free climb with your equipment and rifles and stuff. You've got to have something to help you get up. So those ropes were fixed. I don't remember whether they used all 5, but I know they used 2. And when the time came, the ascent was made at night, which surprised the Germans because I think the first of our fellows arrived just at breakfast time for the Germans.
Wow.
And upset their plans. So they held that ridge against some pretty fierce counterattacks and then got them off it, which made it possible then to attack Belvedere because the Riva Ridge was its cover. So we started on Belvedere, and that was one of the very few experiences I had initially that gave me pause, because the word came at night, we were going to go fix bayonets.
Oh, jeez.
No ammunition. They didn't want anybody shot or shooting for sound or flash. So we went up in the dark. And of course, when we got to the top, there were shooting. and that battle went on. We had the mountain within 24 hours, and that's where I had a real introduction to combat medics, because there were a lot of casualties.
Now, as a medic, did you carry a weapon?
No,
Okay, yeah.
no, I carried a card issued by the Geneva Convention that had my picture and the fact that I was a non-combatant.
A lot of good that did you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had, of course, the regulation helmet, but on it, on each side, was a big red cross. And on my right arm, right above the heart, I wore a brassard with a big red cross. Made good targets. that always, the logic eluded me,
Yeah.
that business. But no, I did not carry a weapon, but I did. I had an entrenching tool for digging foxholes, and it was one of the ones that collapsed. And if I unscrewed, I could flatten the blade. Well, if I held it at right angles and tightened that thing down as hard as I could, I had a weapon. And I envisioned myself having to use it and deciding, shall I do a frontal lobotomy or what? But I didn't. I had close contact with numbers of Germans, but I did not belt anybody with a shovel, but I would have if I had to. So we attacked Belvedere, and that began that long series of February, March, and then the big campaign in April was take a hill, take a hill, take a hill, all the way to the Po Valley, across the Po, then up toward the Alps, because by that time the Germans were in full flight, and they wanted to get out to Austria. And our job was get to the Brenner Pass, or the other one going to Villach and Klagenfurt, I don't remember the name of the pass, to keep them. So the war went on. I never missed a firefight, although I was sent back after Belvedere. I got hurt on Belvedere, and I'm not exactly sure how, but the shoulder was still pretty new, and I think I was either blown up or tripped or something and landed in such a way that I thought I had damaged it, and they sent me down to wherever in a field station and decided that they weren't going to do any more repair, but that I would, here we go again, limited service. You can't go back. And that didn't appeal to me. I hadn't missed anything, and I thought if I go back, I'll end up in someplace I won't like of inactivity. So I left.
Wow.
And I got myself a ride with a 92nd Infantry guy who was truck driving back up, and hitchhiked my way back up and joined my company.
So technically you're AWOL.
Yeah, but they never bothered to report it because they knew where I was going.
Yeah.
I wasn't
Yeah.
running away.
Yeah.
Well, I got back, and a splendid doctor that was with the 2nd Battalion, 85th, Paul Gaffney, who later became kind of a medical legend in Pittsburgh for his remarkable humane practice. But I'd had a little dealing with him, and for some reason we got along, I think probably because he was almost as Irish as I am. But we got back and I reported, and he said, "Lovett, you're crazy." But I had gotten back on the eve of the next push. So off we went. And there we had an interesting time, Gaffney and I. I had had an experience earlier in March where we were near San Cristoforo and had occupied what had been a church and a churchyard area. I was at that time assigned to F Company in the 85th and had been going with them through the combat. And while we were there, a woman came down out of the hills and said that her son had stepped on a mine. She called him mio bambino, so I thought it was a little kid. And could we help? So the lieutenant gave me permission to go with her. And I thought it was just up the road. Well, it went a long way. And I began to see wire that wasn't Allied colored wire.
Oh, geez.
And I was behind the lines and didn't know it. And we got a couple of miles. She stopped at the top of a ridge, and down below I could see a house. And she said to me, "Due tedeschi," 2 Germans. So what am I going to do? I went down, and the boy was not a bambino. He was a good-sized boy. And then the 2 Germans were there. One was a rifleman, the other was a medic. And the medic had tried to take care of the boy, but he didn't have any equipment left. So I did, and we together got him sedated. I had morphine, which the German medic thought was remarkable. That he'd been in too long. He'd been on the Russian front before he got to Italy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he was tired. So we had a very brief discussion. Who's going with whom? And they said the rifleman was suffering from combat fatigue, and he just wanted to go. And the medic said, "Oh, if I go with you, where will I go?" And we were talking French. Fortunately, 2 of us had it.
Huh.
And I explained to him that the last I had heard, the POWs were being sent to Texas. I was remembering Camp Swift. "What do you do in Texas?" I said, "You cut grass, and they have swimming pools." So we talked a little more, and he decided, yes, he'd come. And the rifleman picked up his gun and was ready to go, and I said, "You can't take the gun." So he smashed it against the corner of the building. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, came about a dozen men, Italians.
Oh.
And we had made a litter for the boy, and they picked it up. And the whole procession, we took off.
Huh.
And I got back to the bivouac area, and I came in with this bunch of Italians, and the boy had been wounded, and 2 prisoners, and they thought that was quite a deal. And so I'd had that experience for which I was awarded the Bronze Star.
Wow.
But then, when I got back after that brief hospital stay, and Gaffney and I were given a map and told to set up an aid station front line. And we found the building, and we're going for it, and I noticed little strange things in the grass, and it was tripwires. So it was mined, but there were evidences of regular passage from where we had come on to that building. And I thought, well, maybe they mined it as they were leaving, or maybe it's... So I told Gaffney, I said, I'll go. "Well, no, I'll go with you." And I said, "Captain, you're the doctor." And I said, "If they blow me up, you're still the doctor. If they blow you up, they're stuck with me." And I said, we just won't argue the point. So he said to me, "Lovett, you're crazy." And I got down on my stomach and took off my glasses, because I saw very well at close range.
Hmm.
And as I went through, I could find they had laid out a minefield, but there was a passage through it, and I could see it. So I got us through it and into the building, where we began immediately to get the casualties coming back. So we set that up and treated the casualties. And while I was working my way through the mine layout, I was being sniped.
Oh, jeez.
And which, all I could think of at the time was, he doesn't even know my name. But either he was not a good shot, or I was lucky. But we lasted through the whole firefight. Took a lot of wounded. Had to make choices that you don't like to make about who's going to die first, so he gets treated last. Those are not good choices.
Oh boy, yeah.
But after that, I found out after I was out of service and back in college that Gaffney had put me in and I had another Bronze Star.
Oh really? Oh wow.
They called me up from Hartford to see did I want to come. And I said, I've got one. It took me a while to realize they were talking about another one. And then somewhere in the 50s, I think it was the 50s, someone decided that the combat medical badge, which I had gotten just about the same time that I picked that boy up with his mother, anybody who had gotten that in combat deserved a Bronze Star. So I found out sometime around 1960 that I had another Bronze Star. Now, if I'd had all of them, and maybe I did at the time, but anything like that was worth 5 points.
Oh right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
So I had points for my enlistment, and I had points for overseas, and I had combat points, and I had 5 points for the one Bronze Star I knew because Mark Clark had pinned that on me.
Really?
Yeah, yes.
Wow.
Which reminds me of another raffle I won while we were there. After the war was over, I won a raffle and I got a flight over to the area we had fought through and down over Rome and back, and I was airsick all the way. I don't remember too much. I remember seeing St. Peter's on an angle as he banked around. Whoop! But
Now that when you got injured, you injured your shoulder,
Yeah.
That didn't get you a Purple Heart? Was that?
No.
Wasn't considered
it wasn't a wound.
Oh, okay.
I think technically you have to suffer the loss of blood due to enemy
Oh, okay.
fire. They're very strict rules.
Okay.
But it's on my record that I was injured. And after that, when we got across the Po and up to the Alps, we did a lot of walking then, up through the wonderful North Italian country, Verona, Cividale, Udine. I got one little time, I think maybe 48 hours for R&R, and I went back to Cividale and Pisa. And I went to look at the Tower of Pisa and found it was open, and there were stairs, and I climbed it.
Wow.
Up to the top. And of course, you know what I found at the top? Kilroy was here. I thought, that with just a narrow spiral staircase up and up. So we did have some nice leisure time too. I loved Venice, and was told very early by the first gondolier, because I had to ride the Grand Canal, don't put your hand in the water. Things float. But one of the scenes I'll never forget, the pigeons in St. Mark's Square were a cloud. And somebody startled it, they all went up in the air, and it was just thousands of pigeons. And I was sitting with a couple of friends of mine in St. Mark's Square in the afternoon. We were having a drink, and it became Vespers time. And the clergy came out from whatever with their robes, chanting, and they did a whole tour of St. Mark's Square with this wonderful medieval chant. Everything was serene and quiet. They went back in, and on the heels of that, out came a bunch of Scottish Highlanders with their pipes, and they paraded, I guess, a good Protestant prayer around the thing. And of course, the bagpipes, the pigeons went up. Just legions. I never forgot that sight. Those kilts, the skirling sound of those pigeons going crazy with that noise.
Wow. Wow.
But Venice is a lovely city. And eventually I ended at Lago di Garda, where Mussolini had had his summer home. And the Partigiani had just decided his fate. So we were not allowed into Milano. And we stayed at Garda. The last of the fighting was there. That was nasty fighting. Because on the east side of the lake, maybe the west side, there were tunnels that some of the troops had to go through to get around the lake to, on the other side, were the hotels and the villas and such. And the Germans had rigged an 88 down the tunnel.
Oh, jeez.
And so that was pretty bad. So they started ferrying, and they took the ducks and went around close to the shore and around to get the troops up where they could keep pushing the Germans toward the Alps. And unfortunately, one of those ducks was hit. And I think there were 20 some odd guys drowned. One escaped. And just, I'd say within the last year, maybe two, they found that duck at the bottom of Lake Garda. And I don't know if they ever recovered any of the remains, because things had moved with currents and sand and things, but I know it's been found.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that would make another story.
Yeah.
But then the push from there became faster and faster because the Germans were desperate to get out. And all of a sudden came the surrender. 3 days before VE Day. And then our job became, what do we do with 15-odd thousand? They've got to get them out of here, process them, and another little political consideration then was we were close to the Austrian border, Yugoslav border, and Tito's boys were beginning to make their moves for land grab. So I was sent with the 2nd Battalion squad, there were about 40 of us, by night into Trieste. And was just to let the Yugoslav Red Star boys know you don't. There was no hostility. And they maneuvered around that for several days, and finally Tito withdrew his ambitions to take Trieste and other areas.
Wow.
And then when the war was really over, we ended up with a ski meet.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah. Up at, not Villaca Klagenfurt, but up one of the Austrian runs. And it was won appropriately by Walter Prager, who was a champion skier. And then they began to ship us home, and we went home in segments.
Now, was there any thought of transferring the 10th over to the Pacific Theater, or was that...
Yes, we had been told that when we all got back, we would regroup, and then we were going to the invasion of Japan.
Oh, boy.
And they talked about the Manchurian Alps. But on the way home, I think literally just as we got to Patrick Henry, the A-bomb was used. And we found no reason to go. So they shipped us to Camp Carson and gave us 30 days leave. At the end of 30 days, I went back to Carson and was given another 30 days. They were disbanding the outfit, and they broke it up late November, and I was discharged around the 10th of December or so from Fort Logan, and worked my way home slowly. I stopped in New York, for instance, at not Brooks Brothers, another place to have a suit made, a civilian suit. Then I got back home. Of course, I went back to Fort Devens, and I guess my folks had been keeping track of the arrivals because they published in the paper who was coming in when. And I had been transferred from the 85th into the 10th Special Troops Medics. And we came home, I'm pretty sure there were a bunch of other infantry, not 10th Mountain, with us, the 88th or one of those, 34th, one of them. My folks picked me up at Devens. I had all my papers and stuff. I didn't have to report to anybody, but you get the habit and you wonder, where am I supposed to? So we went home. And Devens is not that far from Hatfield.
Right.
So,
Boy, it must have been quite a homecoming. Particularly, I can't imagine what your folks must have thought, because you couldn't really tell them what you were doing. I'm sure all your letters were all censored and what have you. What a mother must go through with a son overseas like that.
no, and you never know what people are thinking.
Yeah.
You can't.
Yeah.
And my folks did not push for information or make comments. I guess they figured that if they wanted to know anything, I'd tell them, and if I wanted them to know something, I'd tell them. My father's first observations, because when I'd been over there, what do you do for amusement? I'd grown a handlebar mustache. So he wanted that trimmed, please. So we did.
How was that for you? The readjustment from civilian life or from military life and everything you'd been through back to civilian life. Was that transition hard for you?
No,
No.
it wasn't, because one of the things I had learned in the process of Italy was what I wanted to do. And I knew I wanted to be a teacher,
Oh wow.
because I saw the futility of what was happening. And I had in mind all the time that when we went through liberating villages and they had that wild enthusiasm and they rushed out to give you anything they had, sort of thing, I kept thinking, we're going on, and we're going on, we're going home, but who's getting ready for the next war? And, I was right,
Yeah.
which really is distressing.
Yeah.
But no, when I came home in late December, we went to Florida in January to Sarasota, and I lounged on the beach and had the experience of asking a strapping, handsome woman to dance, and found out I was dancing with one of the flying Walendas.
Oh really?
Yeah. And then the second semester began at Wesleyan in February, and I went right back to school.
Wow.
And there were a lot of guys who'd been through stuff. Some of them weren't back anymore. I knew they were okay, but they decided not to come back to campus. There were 13 of us went from Wesleyan. And Ripper Haight was killed. But several of them didn't come back. They went to other colleges. And the GI Bill was a wonderful thing. Wonderful thing.
Man.
I had 2.5 years left to finish at Wesleyan. Then I had my first job at the Chicago Latin School for Boys as a teacher of English. And I began work on my master's at Northwestern. So that with full-time teaching, it took me 5 years of night school, but the GI Bill held all that time. So I got an MA from them in 1953. I taught at the Latin School for 9 years. At the end of my second year, I was made assistant headmaster. And then, in 1953, the boys' school and the girls' Latin school merged, and it became a two-campus lower and upper school, and I became principal of the upper school, and of course, teaching. And I stayed there until 1957, and then I was selected to be headmaster of the Hillsdale School in Cincinnati. It was an all-girls school, but they were looking to be coeducational. So my experience going through the merger.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, and I went to Cincinnati then for, how long was I there? 9 years, same as I was at Latin. And in that time, they never went coeducational. After I left, they did. And after I finished that stint, I was asked by the Culver Military Academy to come and be a counselor and teach, but because they were on the edge of establishing a school academy for girls. Prior to that, the only girls at Culver Military were faculty children. And so I made the move from Cincinnati to Culver, Indiana, and I was there 3 years while they established the groundwork for what I'm sure the various colonels in retirement called separate but equal. To give you an example of military thinking, I came to the first meeting of planning for women campus, and the colonels were all engaged in solemn talk about what will the uniform be. And I looked around, there was no woman. They were all men. And I thought, College of Cardinals. You know?
Yes.
So I suggested that maybe, well, okay, but regular Army retired colonels who'd been through World War II and careers don't take suggestions easily. But finally they settled on a woman whose husband was director of the band, and she was a very calm, even, but insightful woman. So we got the thing established for having the Academy for Girls. Now it's, I'm sure they've forgotten all the angst they had. But that was an excellent school. Academically, I was really delighted to teach there. And then I got an urge because I was contacted about a school in Royalston, Massachusetts, which didn't exist, but they wanted to start one. I thought, gee, that's a challenge. Make a school the way it ought to be. So I agreed, and I went there, met the board. wonderful visionary woman who wanted to do this. The board, who was sure it was going to be a great success, and they gave lots of applause and lots of commendations and no money. And 69-70 was a year when the stock market went. So I couldn't raise, and I didn't sign on to be a money raiser. I laid the whole plan out, and the plan had been to use the houses on Royalston Common. All the houses but one were abandoned. It was a beautiful, beautiful New England setting, but it had died. People didn't want factory for buggy whips and potash, and just over the years it had declined to. There were these wonderful old federal, colonial, post-colonial houses falling into their own cellar holes. So my idea was, well, the school would justify the restoration, and the restoration would make possible the quarters for classes and dormitories and stuff. So I gave it 2 years, and I did get some money from an educational foundation, but at the end of 2 years I could see I was going nowhere, so I had to leave. And then I went to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where the two very old schools wanted to merge. The Moravian Seminary for Women and the Moravian Academy, which was coeducational, two-campus thing, and they wanted to make one school of it. And that was an interesting experience. I spent a couple of years there. Meeting all sorts of points of view. Most of the arguments I got were, there were 2 points to this argument, my side and the wrong side. And you get that. But I did get the upper school established on what had been the female seminary campus, and the downtown school coeducational was in the old buildings, because the Moravians didn't build anything that wasn't going to last. And I found it a very interesting community. They were not inclined to spend money, but when they did, they spent it so that they'd get their money's worth. And some of the buildings had been around since 1700 and something, and they were solid. So I got that going in about 2 years, and I got a call from Duluth, Minnesota. The Bishop of Minneapolis, St. Paul, had closed Duluth Cathedral High School because it was going broke. The high school was in a building that was only about 5 years old. Excellent plant. Had a whole bunch of people who were used to paying tuition of about $300 a year. But it had been run as a Catholic school. So I came there, and the mandate was from the business people who formed the board, we want an all-faith school. So fine. So I came, and I did, in the first year, I managed to get 4 chaplains. I had Michael Lyons from County Mayo in Ireland. Young priest, good tenor, good musician, and a good sense of humor. And I had John Sanders, a young fellow who was a Baptist minister with a very relaxed attitude. I had Harold Stoa, who had succeeded in merging the 2 Lutheran communities in Duluth, the Missouri Synod and the whatever the other one was, which people said was remarkable, and Rabbi Gelbart. And he was the first one. I recruited the first one who said yes. So we had that, and we had a non-denominational school with the student population about 96% Roman Catholic, which meant that the parish priests still figured they owned the curriculum, and they didn't. And St. Scholastica College figured this was the time to move, and I think they were thinking in terms of getting preferential treatment. That's okay for some holidays, holy days, but not the others. There was a little askance when Michael Lyons had an observation for one of the holy days, and the next day was Reformation Day, and John Sanders celebrated that with the kids. They got a great education in the sameness and the differences of the denominations. So in 2 years, I had acquired the faculty and the thing, not without opposition. I was condemned from the altar by one ardent old man, Con Kelleher, who told his congregation I meant well, but when I allowed that woman to have in her class a discussion of abortion, anybody who lets his child in that class is guilty of a mortal sin. So I went to see him, and he was right in his own mind. I couldn't argue with him. But there were 2 points, and he said, there aren't. And he said, what you don't understand, my boy, is that when the bishop closed that school, he didn't close the debt. And every parish here is paying $10,000 a month on the mortgage. And yet we have no say in what will be taught. I said, Father, I can't fault that, but I didn't come here with the knowledge of your debt, and I wouldn't change what I'm trying to do because, I said, you take that up with the bishop. Well, the bishop was on the board of trustees, so it never went anywhere. But we got the school going, and then I ran afoul of one trustee. He was an interesting man in that he was a veteran, Air Force, and I think in a way he was an honest-to-goodness egomaniac. He boasted that he was in debt for $1 million because he bought the majority stock in a television station. And he was active in Duluth business affairs. But at the end of 2 years, he came in one day and told me they didn't need me anymore. I said, I thought we agreed to 3 years. Do you have a contract? I said, no. We shook hands. Not with me, you didn't. I said, you're right, I didn't. And I said, well, if you hired me, why? He said, well, we needed your expertise, but we don't need it anymore. So that was that. And there is no more Duluth Cathedral High School. And I don't know whether it slipped back into the aegis of the church or not. But it was interesting experiment, and it gave me another perspective on doing business with religious groups, Moravians or established churches of any kind. That they have their little ways. But after that, I went to Duluth. Oh, while I was in Duluth, I went to the University of Minnesota campus in Duluth, and I got training in the Orton Gillingham method of teaching dyslexics. At that point, it was beginning to be in the national awareness that there was this thing called dyslexia, and kids weren't just lazy or dumb. And so I then got an appointment to be assistant head of Foreman School in Litchfield, Connecticut, which was one of the very few schools designed to teach dyslexics on the college preparatory program. So I was there for a couple of years to get that going and use my experience. And I'm pretty sure that school is still going along because dyslexia is not something that is a fad.
Yeah, right.
And then I went to the university school in Milwaukee, and I was there 7 years as teacher and head of the upper school, director of curriculum, and I retired from there in 1986. And so I went then we had a home we built in the Adirondacks, and I went back there and joined the faculty at SUNY Plattsburgh in the English department, and taught there for till 86, 87, 88, 94. And then I sold the house there, the property, because I had 14 acres. And when I built the house, I was not yet 50. And I could see certain disadvantages, like mowing, and when I realized that the best medical facilities were in Burlington, Vermont, and that meant you go out by helicopter, I began to think seriously that there might be another way to life. So we moved to Waverly, Ohio, to a community called the Bristol Village. It's a retirement center, and stayed there about 10 years. At that time, I was on the faculty at Ohio University. And see, over the years while I'd been teaching, I'd also been following my own particular academic interests, which was in early and medieval Irish literature.
Oh, wow.
And the Celtic studies. So I got a master's from the University College Dublin in 1984. And that allowed me some fun in teaching. And again, like some of the other things I followed, very little carryover value in terms of cash when you quit the profession. But I taught at Ohio U until 2000. And then I came back from a trip to Greece, and we'd then gone to Ireland again, and was told I was too hard to schedule because I wouldn't teach summer school in Southern Ohio and various things, so they said, you're just too hard. That was a good reason. The real reason was I was 80 and they could hire people for less than me. It never said that,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it happened. And if you're adjunct faculty, the institution will find a way to use you to get maximum benefit, except for you. Can't ever have more than 3 classes, because then you would qualify for benefits. So, and I had a little difficulty with financial offices because I had been with TIAA CREF, which is a national organization in non-public schools and colleges, retirement, and it follows you wherever you go.
Hmm.
Well, SUNY Plattsburgh offered TIAA CREF, but I already had it. But the rules said if I taught, I had to belong. But the rules in TIAA said you can't do it twice. So I left that for them to solve in Albany, and I don't know if they ever did. But I did run into this business about unions. I had to belong to a union. Had to. But because I wasn't full-time, I wasn't protected. But I had to pay the dues. Fortunately, I never had to call on the union to save me. You get into those interesting situations.
Yeah, yeah.
And it always reminds me of the old, in very old Irish literature, there's an obligation put on a champion. It's called a gish. And it means he is bound to do or not do what the gish says. Well, you'll find that a hero would have a gish on him that he's never to cross a stream unless he's ahead of everybody else. That's easy enough, but then you find somebody put another gish on him that he's not allowed to cross a stream except, So they managed to maneuver to bring downfalls and heroic events, and that's all I could think of. I'm teaching kids about this old gish, and here they are arguing, you have to belong, but you can't.
Yeah, yeah.
And then in 2002, I gave the last of my lectures with the National Conference for Irish Studies. I had joined that back in the 60s when it was first founded in Chicago. And over the years, and watched it grow and watched it become pretty much the property of the historians rather than literature people. But I gave occasional lectures, and I gave my last one in 2002 and had my friend from University College Dublin on the panel with me. And Patricia Kelly was a remarkable woman who was part of an effort to make a digital language for scholars that would allow the translation of the ancient Irish manuscripts into a digital language so that regardless of your background, you could get the translations. And it started with Cork University and the Royal Irish Academy, and they called it Curia. And she was the director of that. And so we did some work together on that, and then until I moved, 2002, I was the American representative to the American Conference for Irish Studies on this program that was being developed. It switched from being Curia, became Project Celt, and it moved from the Royal Irish Academy, where I had done some studying, to Cork University, where they had all the latest technical facilities to deal. And so my last lecture was on Project Celt as a useful tool, and Patricia came and did a wonderful program on dealing with the old manuscripts and some of the enchanting difficulties trying to decide if that character like this, is it really F or is it S? And having to get the context to find out, well, I guess it was S. So then I came out here.
So how many years altogether then were you in education, combined with all your...
48 to 2000, 52.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. Well, you see, I'm pretty durable.
Yeah.
And in that time, I never put in a year that I didn't teach, because I thought it was very important to stay in the classroom. More administrators should, particularly the ones out here.
Mm.
You find a fellow's made superintendent of the whole district at kind of salary I never commanded. And you find out, what's his background? Well, he has a doctorate degree. Well, fine, but in what? Cafeteria management. That's, yeah.
So what brought you to Colorado?
Well, I loved Colorado when I was
Right.
here with the 10th.
Right, yeah.
And I always had hoped to be able to come back, but never could find a paying job out here. So, but my older daughter went to the Colorado Women's College
Ah,
and met a man from the Colorado School of Mines. And they married, and she graduated in 73. And she came back here to live. So had many occasions to come and visit. And so I had plenty of Colorado, long distance, and visits here. But to come and stay, then that's when I left Bristol Village and came out here. And no, I hadn't ever quit teaching because I lived in Longmont until last year. And Longmont has what I seriously think is about the best senior center I've encountered in anywhere I've lived. It's sponsored by the city, and it has a marvelous array of programs. Are you familiar with it at all?
yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. So I met Teresa Schulte. I went in, right after I moved here to see, and I said, is there anything I can do? I've done a lot of teaching. So I got on the program, and for the last 8 or 10 years, I've been doing programs for the senior center there
Oh, wow.
on everything from Celtic to whatever I thought would interest people. And what I like about the clientele at that senior center is they're interested in being educated, not entertained. And there's a big difference.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, I had the experience while I was at Wesleyan as an undergraduate, both before and after the war, of being on a first name basis with Robert Frost and Robert Coffin and Wilbur Snow. They had a program where Frost was at Amherst, Snow was at Wesleyan, and Coffin was at Bowdoin, and they would take turns. And once a year, they got together on the Wesleyan campus. And if you were one of the lucky ones, you were invited to come to Bill Snow's house and listen to him talk about poetry and such things. And I had originally, we had a little private joke, those of us who were part of that. It was warm nights with frost and snow. And we were that. Well, when Coffin came along, we changed it from frost to snow to Coffin. And we got to listen to him talk about contemporary poets and poetry and how to do it, to argue about the turn of a word. is it better, Bill Snow said, is it better to talk about the borning of a baby or the birthing of a baby? And they would go on, and Frost was an interesting man.
Wow.
Not the kindest man in the world.
No.
No.
Hmm.
But very fixed in certain ways. He liked softball. And we'd play a little at softball. And he thought it was okay, not only okay, but it ought to be a regular rule that you could slide into first base and be safe. You couldn't dissuade him. But we had some interesting arguments about that. We did. Coffin had a marvelous speaking voice. And at that time, he was better known and more popular on the circuit than either Frost or Snow.
Really? Huh.
And that didn't sit well with Frost. And I remember when Edwin Arlington Robinson, who was another one of the main poets, had a 50th celebration. I remember it was his birthday or 50th poem or something, but he issued invitations, and Frost declined. And Mark Van Doren, I think it was, who asked him, "Why didn't you go?" And he said, "There's only room for one heavyweight champion."
Wow.
And I had a lovely story. I wish I could have told it to Frost, but he was gone by then. When I first moved to Bristol Village, I joined the men's chorus, and there was a very good musician woman who did accompanying and arranging. And she wanted to do a program. I've forgotten the name of the composer, but it was some of Frost's poetry set to music. And one of the poems is "Two roads diverged in a yellow wood," and he went on. And she wanted that recited as the introduction to then the choral version of that. And I said, "Well, Margaret, I happen to have Frost on tape reciting that poem." "Oh, wonderful, bring it in." So I brought it in and played it, and he read his poem, "Two roads diverged in a yellow wood." And she listened, she said, "That won't do. That's not the way that poem should be read." So we didn't use Robert Frost, we used her husband. You meet some interesting people.
Well, talk a little bit about family now, as we slowly wind down this interview.
Family.
Yeah.
Well, I have a son and 2 daughters. My son lives in Fort Wayne. My older daughter lives here in Louisville. And my youngest is in East Swansea, New Hampshire. Now, I have a grandson, Tim, and a granddaughter, Amanda, and a granddaughter, Jennifer. Jane has Kurt, Kate, Christy. Susie has Beth and Jesse. Those are grandchildren. And then I have, 3 great-grandchildren that belong to my daughter in Louisville. They live in Arizona. Kate lives in Pennsylvania, and she has a little boy, just born, maybe 6 months ago. Bill's Mandy has a son, Jenny has a daughter, Tim has 2 boys. So I have 7 or 8 great-grandchildren.
Wow.
And they're scattered from Maine to Massachusetts, New York State, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Colorado. Yeah.
And how long have you and your wife been married?
My wife died 4 years ago.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
And Barbara, whom you met, was many years ago one of my students.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. We reconnected
Oh, wow.
a while back, and I've been lucky.
Wow.
There's a couple of things that bother me about the 10th. And one of them is that cyclically there is a mania for monuments. There's a very appropriate, fitting monument at Tennessee Pass.
Mhm.
But there's a monument at Vail, and there's a monument they're trying to put up at Watertown near Fort Drum, and there's a highway in New England, and there's part of a highway in New York State, and there's a plaque hammered into Whiteface Mountain, and there are license plates galore, and there's kind of a monument mania that strikes every so often. And it distresses me because it's manifested itself in passing the legacy on to what they call the 10th Mountain Division Light. They're their own outfit, entirely different from us. But they say, somebody says, it's historically inspiring to keep the patch and the legends. I can't agree with that.
Yeah.
Can I agree with the monuments?
Yeah, yeah.
And there was a whole group of people called the Descendants who spur this thing around. The 10th alumni who could afford it used to take trips to Italy every couple of years. Well, now the Descendants are doing it. I have to think that I'm sort of favor the last guy with a bottle of Irish whiskey.
All right.
Yeah. But I have expressed my disappointment and disillusionment a couple of times. It doesn't do any good. I had some good friends in the 10th. Remarkable people. One of my, I thought of, while I was talking about combat, Andy Hastings was a first-rate musician and a first-rate skier. And he was badly, badly wounded. And after the war, I had lost track of him because I was in Chicago and he was back in New Hampshire. But they told him he wouldn't walk again. So Andy got on his bicycle and he pedaled out to Los Angeles and back. And among other things. But he had a trumpet he brought to Camp Hale, which initially didn't make him popular, but they realized he was really a good trumpeter. And he had a little band after the war, and we'd have, let's see, I belonged to the New England chapter, not the one here. And we'd have meetings, and the band would come and they'd play for dancing and such, and Andy always led the band and did his trumpet solos. But he had a really good ear for pitch, same as I do. And we were in an artillery barrage at one point, and we began to argue. A piece of shrapnel goes by, it goes wing. And I said, Andy, that's F sharp. He said, it is not. We began to listen to the shrapnel and argue about the pitch. And Colonel Stone, who was devoid of a sense of humor, was sort of hidden under a rock somewhere and keeping his person safe. Finally, he said, don't you men have anything to do? Middle of an artillery barrage. Oh, yeah. Well, I saw a lot of Andy after the war. We corresponded and then got together when I finally retired to the Adirondacks. And when we went on the train from Devon's, I met Andy and his best friend, Dick Mansfield, whom they called Mad Dog, Elton Beard, Claire Simons, Warren Reynolds. We represented, and Chip Lofstead was with me. We had 2 from Wesleyan, 1 from Brown, a couple from the University of New Hampshire,
Wow.
1 from Notre Dame. Ray Franklin was from Notre Dame.
Wow.
Just the 9 of us. And Dick Mansfield, when we got down to the train, was told by the corporal, "You're in charge. You're the acting corporal." And Andy said, "Why?" And he said, "He's the tallest." So that gave Dick prestige. I think he's the only one of us left alive now on the train trip. And he's up in New Hampshire somewhere. But Andy was a great collector of information on the 10th. And for a long time, he was the archives before the Resource Center was opened. And he used to write a column for the Blizzard, our alumni newspaper, Andy's Foxhole. And it was always lively and entertaining. But he died very suddenly. Elton Beard, we call him Buck, was one of the most capable manual arts teachers I ever saw. He taught in Keene and around that area, and then he taught in Maine, but he could build things. And I used to go up to his place in New Hampshire, Sand Pond, a beautiful little place. And he had redone his grandfather's cottage so it was year-round, possibly. But among other things, he had made a stove. He had the frame of one of those pot-bellied stoves with the open work, and he had built the fill-in members that used to be done sometimes with sheet metal, sometimes, but he did it with soapstone, which is a great store of heat. It was absolutely beautiful. And he also had some of the earliest recordings done on a cylinder.
Oh, wow.
And he had things like Two Black Crows and Cohen on the Telephone, and those things that went way back, way before I was around. And we used to get together. He had a ski school at Monadnock. But I've lost track of almost everybody.
Yeah.
The last ones I knew, there was a fine fellow here, lived in Boulder, Bill Carey's, who had been in F Company and had been the one in the steeple watching when the woman came down to get help for her son. And when I got here, I got a call one day. "Are you Francis Lovett?" "Yes." "You Bud Lovett?" "Yes." "Did you?" "Yes, I did." "Well, I'm..." So,
Wow.
and then I found out every time I had moved, it was in the register, he kept trying to catch up with me. So we did get together a few times. We used to meet once a month for lunch with him and Hugh Evans and Peterson and a couple of others. I think they're all gone now except Hugh. And I don't know what shape he's in. But I didn't join the Rocky Mountain chapter here. For one thing, it's too far away. And I don't like to drive in Denver.
Yeah.
So I stayed with the New England chapter. You asked about family. My background, includes my grandparents who were Irish speaking. And when they all came over here, my mother was the only one born in this country. She was the last of 9. And I never learned any Irish. They didn't speak it. He was in this country. He would speak English and do his business in English. So I often wished him no harm, but lingering misery when I was struggling with Irish in the academic level, and I could have had a head start.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But I think, I know I'm the only alumnus of Williston Academy who was in the 10th Mountain Division. And I think I am the only 10th Mountain Division alumnus who's conversant with the Irish language. And again, cash value.
Well, the last question I like to ask in these interviews, when you look back on that time in the military, in the 10th in particular, and everything you went through, how did it play a role in your life, change your life, affect your life? Or as fascinating of a life as you had, or was it just simply just a chapter in your life that you went through? How would you answer that?
Well, it certainly affected my life in that when I watched those children waiting for us to empty our mess gear so they could have some garbage, that's convinced me about teaching. I
Wow.
had the tendency toward it anyway, but that convinced me you have to teach because ignorance, poverty are why you have war. And so far, I don't think I've done a very good job. I spent my whole career teaching people to look at both sides and don't let anybody tell you what to think or how to think. But I can't say I was accepted universally. So the 10th did make that experience, certainly shaped me, finally, fixed on what I was going to do. In other ways, yes, for years I worked summers in the Adirondacks, taught climbing, taught technical climbing, taught wrestling, and had a wonderful time with the outdoors that I enjoyed. I had enjoyed the privilege of leaving Camp Hale with a couple of friends and just going up and camping without reveille and orders and stuff. It's your free time. I think it taught me how important it is to do something with free time that isn't just wasted.
Yeah.
It makes you, in a way, restless. I sometimes felt guilty during my teaching career, or sometimes even now I still feel a little guilty because I'm not doing something.
Wow.
But I learned the value of packing it in. We had a group. We called it the Antipasto Club. And there was Karl Maas, who spoke German and French. He'd been with the embassy in Berlin before the war. We had Bill Ferguson, California. He spoke Spanish fluently. We had Willie Neely, who was aiming for State Department work, and he spoke French and elementary Urdu. And me. I had French and the rudiments then of Irish. So we had that was the requirement to get in. You had to speak a foreign language. And we would solicit from our families supplies for an outing. Moss would get pumpernickel, my mother sent oatmeal cookies. Bill Ferguson's mother sent rum soakies, which were very good, and such. And we would go out and have a weekend. Sometimes we'd find a place to fish, and sometimes just camped and didn't do anything, just talked, settled the affairs of the world.
Wow.
And 8. But we always took wine with us. And one time, we went up to a little area that we kind of liked on Homestake. And knowing we would come back, we buried our wine. And got back and found out we were going to Texas. So, somewhere up there on Homestake,
Oh, wow.
there'll be a few glass shards. I'm sure the first winter got them. But we always look back as long as we were communicating as, you suppose anybody found our wine?
Wow. Great story.
Yeah. It made a difference in my teaching, the experience in the 10th, because I learned how very important it is to be accurate in communicating, and how easy it is to be misunderstood if your tone of voice is wrong. And I learned that you cannot put in writing what you can put in speech. And I used to use an example. Where are you going? What? I said, where are you going? Where are you going? What? Whole different answer.
Yeah.
You can't write that. So I have always tried to say accurately what I want people to hear. I haven't always succeeded. They sometimes heard what I didn't say. But I think that's important, and that comes from having listened and observed people give orders and have the order misunderstood because the tone of voice or the use of words was wrong. We had one, and I confess I've never given his name, but I used his language in teaching younger kids how not to say things, because this sergeant was giving us information in something, and we challenged him, said, no, come on, that can't be right. And he said, no kidding, man, I have saw it did quite some little. And that stored here, and I've used that many times. Now, we knew what he meant, but he certainly had no respect for his language, or he didn't know any better. But he was in a position of command. And it puts a big obligation on West Pointers. Yeah. I did have the pleasure of knowing a few politicians in the 10th. Francis Sargent was a nice man. He became officer. And when I knew him, when I was doing Royalston Academy, he was governor of Massachusetts and invited me to the inauguration ball. Well, what else is of interest to you? Have you covered me?
Well, that's my question. I know we probably got the tip of the iceberg of your story, but is there anything, any questions I didn't ask you that you wanted to talk about? Any stories that have floated to the top as we've been talking here, or do you think by and large we got a pretty good, well-rounded look at?
I think so. I
your
think
story?
it's important to know that the 10th was not all physical hardship. That there was fun and games.
Yeah.
Oh, for instance, Andy Hastings, of whom I spoke with affection, he is the one who accompanied me when we rappelled at the Brown Palace Hotel in the atrium. And we're met at the bottom. We were a little short on rope. We're met at the bottom with some very nice lawmen who said, now, boys. We'd had a little inspiration at the ship's tavern.
What a great story.
Oh, yeah. But you get perceptions. Yeah.
Well, it certainly has been a fascinating life to date. Fascinating story. I want to.
I'm just getting started.
Yeah, I know. I like it. I'm sure, like I said, I'm sure we only got the tip of the iceberg. But I certainly want to thank you for spending the time today to tell your story. But as just as important, I would like to thank you for your service to our country.
Well, I appreciate that. I do. And I've received thanks in the last couple of years, more than I ever did. I think people have become a little conscious of it since now so much of our population has never known peace.
Right. Yeah.
That's sad.
Yeah.
I was brought up in the only peacetime.
Yeah.
22 to 41.
Yeah.
Yep.
Fair enough. Well, thank you, Francis.
Thank you. Okay, that was taken on my first furlough in 1943, September. My mother insisted when I got home. The upper row show the Bronze Star with 2 oak leaf clusters. At the far right of the upper row is the area Mediterranean, European, with the 2 battle stars that the 10th Mountain earned in their campaign in the Apennines and the Po River. In the second row is my Good Conduct Medal, the patch of the 10th Mountain Division, and the others are campaign medals, and finally ending in the Victory Medal. The Combat Medical Badge is directly under my division patch, and under that is the discharge button we wore, affectionately called the ruptured duck.
Yep. Very nice.